all else being equal, this is the point where you have the maximum opportunity to produce vitamin D per day.
Yes.
This is that point.
Which ever more evidence suggests that is something that you might want to be doing right now, given that it seems to be protective against coronavirus.
Yes, it's something you should want to do for lots of reasons. It makes you much healthier and less vulnerable in general, but with respect to COVID-19, it might be particularly important. Incidentally, I ran across something on this front, as long as we're talking about daylight. Mm-hmm. A recent paper reflects that one of the hypotheses that we advanced and talked about turns out to be right, which is that one of the reasons that SARS-CoV-2 is not transmitted outdoors as easily as indoors, in fact, vastly less easy, mm-hmm. is that apparently UV light is highly destructive of SARS-CoV-2. So we now know that for a fact, which opens the possibility, if that's the only factor, then it suggests that outdoors might not be so safe at night, whereas if it's one of a couple of factors, like we've talked about, the other factor that's probably highly relevant is the airflow and the volume, the absolute volume of the air in question. Mm-hmm. So we're developing a kind of model in which, for some reason, instead of a virus being able to get into you and infect you, there's some level at which you can absorb these things not specifically. They're dealt with maybe by macrophages or something, and at the point you've overwhelmed the macrophages, then you are in jeopardy. And in an outdoor environment, the dissipation of these things, and if it's daytime, the destruction of them mm-hmm. in the sunlight makes it unlikely you will cross that threshold, whereas indoors, it can happen in a 5-minute conversation if somebody's sick and expelling virus towards you.
And I think most of our intuitions, if we've spent any time in the physical world, are pretty good on this front. I'm remembering, as you talked about, I was in San Antonio in November of last year, and I found myself having dinner one night at an outdoor restaurant, but it was in a little alley between two buildings. And I had been very eager to sit outside, because I always am, unless conditions are stifling in some regard. But because it was really narrow between two rather tall buildings, I had the sense that the air wasn't as fresh as I wanted it to be. And, given what we know about these transmissions inside, interior restaurants of the coronavirus, where people sitting at sort of in line of the HVAC flow end up getting infected at much higher rates than those people outside of that. Of course, if you're in some kind of an urban jungle, outside probably isn't going to be as protective as if you're in an outside space with a lot of airflow as well. So we've got a few of these parameters to wrestle with.
Absolutely. And we have indicators from history that people have intuited certain things, sometimes incorrectly. So I believe that both plague and malaria have been attributed to stale air in the historical past, before the proper germ theory of disease told us what was going on. In the case of malaria is exactly what it means. It's not really a question of air volume. It's a question of mosquitoes, which inhabit swampy kind of air. And in the case of...
So they've just got, at a gross level, at an imprecise level, the observation is kind of accurate, right? Like if you're hanging out in an area with stagnant water that tends to produce stagnant air that smells of the anoxic stuff that it's emerging from, you're more likely to have mosquitoes around, which are the things that vector malaria. So it's inaccurate, but there is an observation that's real at the base.
And it's also true that in the case of plague, which at least in the majority of cases is transmitted by fleas, you're also talking about a place, if you were in some dank place where, there were rats, rats in particular have a smell that you can detect walking into a room. So there is some sort of indicator in the air, and it's not that you're smelling fleas, but nonetheless, it's good enough. The sense that that's maybe not a smell that you want to hang around is... And
at some level, both of them are indicators of kind of, trust your nose, trust your senses.
Yeah.
If something is telling you back off, just like if you run into a decaying, roadkill or a pile of feces, everything in you says don't get closer to that.
Yeah, those intuitions are built around that, which of course also fits with our sense of beauty, perhaps being an indicator of lots of proxies for things that are useful or valuable or tend to imply opportunity or whatever. So anyway, what a shock that we are well designed for environments in which our senses can detect things that clue us into hazards we may not be able to name or describe.
And that many of us feel more afield than maybe we even recognize our ancestors would have, because so many of us are not even living now in the environments in which we grew up. Not only are our aphorisms, our cultural norms built around places that most of us may not live at the moment, but our developmental environment is not a match for our current environment. And so we are simply out of touch with our own selves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we are out of our depth in an environment that we have largely created.